Hey YouTube, how's it going? Dustin Smith here with A2K, Allegiance to the King. Today we got another exciting Friday video for you on responsibly reading the book of Revelation. Yes, today we're going to talk about the book of Revelation, and our topic today deals with when the book of Revelation was actually written, okay? Was it written in the early date, which is around the 60s of the first century, or was it written in the late date, the 90s of the first century? This, of course, has a lot of bearing into the social situation of the seven churches to which John writes, and placing those in their context and helping us to understand what sort of message John was writing in his apocalypse to these churches and how those churches were to understand and respond to them based on what was going on around them in their own culture and world. Okay, so we got the two options, the two major options that are given by modern scholars. One is the early date in the 60s, and the other one is the late date in the 90s. Okay, and so today I'm going to give you my top 3 reasons why I'm absolutely convinced that the book of Revelation was written in the 90s. I am arguing for the late date of the book of Revelation. I've heard a lot of information trying to argue both particular sides, but I think that it is really unarguable and pretty self-explanatory that the book of Revelation was written in the 90s, and we're going to look at 3 reasons to make that particular point, okay? Our first reason today as to why the book of Revelation was written in the 90s is the book of Revelation's obsession with Babylon, okay? Its obsession with Babylon. In Revelation chapter 17 and chapter 18 are 2 major chapters that deal with Babylon as the personification of this woman, this harlot, this whore, and this woman is the one that sits on 7 hills in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 9. That is very clearly and unarguably a geographical reference to Rome. Babylon here is a reference to Rome. It's kind of a symbolic way of describing Rome. It's not a code name, because anyone who understood what Rome did to the Jerusalem temple in the year 70, in that Rome destroyed the Jerusalem temple just as Babylon destroyed the first Jewish temple in the year 587 BC, would certainly understand why Rome could be understood as this new Babylon. If the former Babylon destroyed the first temple in 587 BC, then certainly it becomes appropriate to describe Rome in the metaphor of Babylon after it had destroyed the temple in the year 70. So the only reason that would explain why Rome could be described as Babylon presupposes that the destruction of the temple had already taken place. Okay, so the argument for the earlier date in the 60s doesn't make any sense here, because in the 60s the Jerusalem temple had not yet been destroyed by Rome. The book of Revelation definitely indicates to us that Babylon is this terrible, nasty, harlot force. It is used to describe the city of Rome, and that only makes sense after Rome had destroyed the temple in the same way that actual Babylon had destroyed the temple. All right, our second reason as to why the book of Revelation was written in the 90s rather than the 60s deals with what the letter to Laodicea has to say about that particular church. Now, a little history is in order. Laodicea suffered a crippling earthquake in the year 60. Okay, in the year 60 AD, they suffered a crippling earthquake. And yet Laodicea was so wealthy, so prosperous, that instead of having to ask Rome for financial help in order to rebuild that city, Laodicea basically says, nope, that's okay. We've got it taken care of because we have enough money on our own. Okay, and when you read the letter to Laodicea, you can see that Laodicea is being chastised because it is so prosperous, because it is so rich, because it is so luxurious. Okay, and this is not the kind of thing that you would say a few years after it had been completely destroyed by an earthquake. No, the indication when you read the letter to Laodicea is that some time had passed since that earthquake had taken place for that city to rebuild itself and to regain its status as a rich, luxurious, prosperous city. Okay, so that's just another one of those external factors about history and about geography, and particularly about what actually happened with an earthquake in the year 60, that doesn't make much sense if the book of Revelation was written in the 60s. It makes much more sense if it was written sometime later in the 90s to where Laodicea is not dealing with the after effects of that crippling earthquake. It had enough time to rebuild itself and to regain its pride as a rich and prosperous city. Our third and final reason as to why the book of Revelation was written in the 90s rather than the 60s deals with the testimony of Polycarp. Who is Polycarp, you might ask? Polycarp was an early 2nd century bishop of Smyrna. Okay, Smyrna is the second city to which John writes in the letters to 7 churches. It starts with Ephesus and then it goes to Smyrna, starting in Revelation 2 and verse 8, and it goes all the way to verse 11. Smyrna was a city that had a church to where Polycarp was the bishop in the 2nd century, and Polycarp tells us in his letter to the Philippians, this is Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, chapter 11, he indicates that Smyrna was not known to the Apostle Paul when Paul had written his letter to the original Philippians. Okay, so just to make sure we got this clear, Polycarp, who is the bishop of Smyrna, wrote a letter to the Philippians in the 2nd century, and he tells them that Smyrna did not have a Christian community when Paul, the Apostle Paul, who, by the way, died in the middle of the 60s AD, when Paul wrote a letter to the Philippians, a letter that we actually have in the New Testament. So if there was no Christian community during the time of Paul, in the late 60s, it seems unlikely that the book of Revelation could have been written in the 60s, where Smyrna is written to as a Christian community that has already existed for some time. Okay, so there we have 3 reasons, some dealing with some internal evidence within the book of Revelation, and some dealing with some external evidence outside of the book of Revelation that seems to favor a later date, a date in the 90s, which is the more popular scholarly view regarding the date of when Revelation was written. So this can help you to place the things of the book of Revelation in their context, within their culture, whether it be the religious context or its political context or its theological context, and that way it will help you to more responsibly read and understand the book of Revelation. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share for more videos from Allegiance to the King. My name is Dustin Smith. I'm with A2K. Until next time, you take care.